Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome. My name is Karen Eifler, and I direct our Garaventa Center for Catholic Intellectual Life and American Culture here at UP. And still, the thrill does not leave for welcoming audiences in 3D after lots of years of pushing a red button to start a webinar. So thank you so much for making the extra effort to come out for what I know is going to be an amazing evening. And whatever gaps there are can be filled in with the Rice Krispie treats that are waiting for you in the hall afterwards to continue the conversation. Well, as we settle in to learn from these students about the uses and abuses of power and words, we acknowledge that we do so on unceded land, wrested from many tribes of indigenous people whose legacy and ongoing strivings are now represented by the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. May tonight's unpacking of power, rhetoric, and incarnation help all of us bend toward pursuing true justice, meaningful peace, and the flourishing of all. I'm happy to turn the mic and evening over to Dr. David Turnblum, a professor of theology at University of Portland who has achieved beloved status in his early years here on the Bluff. He's passionate about reminding us that we are all theologians because we all receive and ponder moments of grace and transcendence, or the lack thereof, and we think about that too. Since his first year at UP, he's been the catalyst behind the Garaventa Center's annual Why Theology Needs Lord of the Rings, Ted Lasso, Schitt's Creek series, and he's always seeking ways to make the rarefied world of theology accessible and practical to all. If I know Dr. Turnblum, he's going to make sure the spotlight shifts pretty rapidly to his students, so let's get that process underway right now as I welcome Dr. Turnblum to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm just going to start off with a couple of thank yous. First, I would like to thank you all for being here, and I would also like to thank Karen for, shepherding this project through this, setting it up and getting it marketed so well, obviously. Thank you all for being here. I would also like to thank the Summer Undergraduate Research Experience Program. For those of you, especially the students here who don't know, there is quite a bit of money that gets awarded to professors who want to do research with students over the summer. And so for the last couple summers, I've been lucky enough to get some money to carry out research with students, and I will introduce those students to you momentarily. The next person I would like to thank, who I will introduce a little bit later, is Lex Crawford, who is going to be our respondent this evening. More about her later. But now I would like to thank mostly my research colleagues. I want to go through the people who are going to be presenting this evening just real briefly. So you know their names, but they will have their names on the slides of the sections that they're going to be presenting. So I want to start off with three people who I founded this lab with in the summer of 2021. Meg Breen, who just there we go. There, Meg Breen, who is a history major. We have Noah Lamberger, who is a philosophy major, and those two will be graduating very shortly. We also had Kate Seddon, who is a junior this year, and a sociology and social work double major. The following summer, we were joined by Sophia Suna, who is a junior communications major. And then this year, we were lucky enough to be joined by Maya Das Hamill, who is an alum, graduated in December with a psych degree, and Ben Carey DiGregorio, who is a philosophy and political science double major. So those are my research colleagues who will be presenting. Before I turn it over to Noah and Sophia, I want to point out one more person who is gracious enough to be here this evening, and that's Carly Daly. If Carly can just raise your hand, everybody see that Carly is a social worker from UP's Wealth Health and Wellness Center. And she was kind enough to be here tonight because the topic that we're going to be going over is one that is a difficult topic. And we want to make sure that everybody here prioritizes their own well-being during the presentation. If at any point you feel anxious or uncomfortable and you want to get up and take a break, please do not hesitate to stand up mid-sentence, whoever's talking, and go take care of yourself. If at any point you would like to talk to Carly, she'll be up there and we'll be hanging out a little bit afterwards. The Wellness Center has their hours from 8:30 to 4:30, Monday through Friday, and Carly will be happy to talk about getting you an appointment if that's something you're interested in. Okay. Did I get that right? We're good? All right. Awesome. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Noah and Sophia to talk to you about rhetoric and its power. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. So great to see you all here. My name is Sophia Osuna.
And I'm Noah Lamberger.
All right, so let's get started. This is our table of contents for this evening. You could glance over it in case there's any sensitive information that you might want to look out for in the future and step out, as Dr. Turnblum said, at any time you feel uncomfortable, completely understandable. But first, Noah and I are going to get started talking about rhetoric. We're going to define rhetoric and its relevance. So rhetoric is a large term encompassing a broad range of connotations, and considering this, it's essential that we provide you with our working definition of rhetoric that we've used throughout this analysis, and also talk about the relevance of rhetoric in the context of domestic violence and church-perpetuated sexual abuse. So starting by defining rhetoric, generally speaking, we define rhetoric as the use of language to persuade. And what we mean by this is that the ways that we use language can help us to communicate and convey messaging so that it's received by audiences in a certain way. So our choice of words, our tone of voice, all of these things can contribute to the ways that audiences perceive our messaging as speakers, but also our credibility as speakers as well.
We also really want to emphasize that rhetoric isn't inherently positive or negative, but rather it's a tool for communication that can be either harmful or helpful. And then similarly, it's sometimes but not always intentional, depending on a speaker's aim, purpose, or awareness of the situation.
And now we're going to talk about the relevance of rhetoric.
So while potentially unassuming, rhetoric actually has great power to impact issues of power and repression. And this is because how we talk about rhetoric and how we understand and define our situations impacts the way we view them. So it impacts the way we can view ourselves, our relationship. It can shape our worldview and ultimately influence our behavior.
So this is especially relevant when applied to domestic violence and church-perpetuated sexual abuse because, as Noah mentioned, rhetoric not only influences our perception of the world around us, but also the way that we interact with situations of power, specifically power relations and abuse. And this is because oftentimes abusers as speakers will try and convince audiences of what they are or are not capable, what they can or cannot do, how they should or shouldn't feel, etc. Right? And so this is incredibly important to note here, especially when it comes to decisions that survivors often have to make in situations where they're in toxic or harmful environments. For example, like the decision to stay in a toxic environment or to leave. And this is not to say at all that the decision to stay or leave an abusive relationship is an easy one. In fact, it's much more complex than that, as we know. But this is all to say that just as the survivor of domestic violence is persuaded to believe that they cannot leave their relationship, the parishioner feels that they cannot leave the church even when staying sustains trauma. So that's why rhetoric is relevant to this study.
So our project is looking at the rhetoric by clerics in the Catholic Church related to church-perpetuated sexual abuse. And so in analyzing this rhetoric, we kind of identified 4 main rhetorical devices that we think really underpin all of this. So we're going to go through those 4 now. The first being ambiguity. And ambiguity occurs in language when a statement meaning is unclear and it leaves room for different interpretations from the audience. So it burdens the listener by destabilizing their understanding and leaves intentions really unclear. And a key way that this is done is metaphor. So this might look like in like a relationship context, somebody saying like, you're my whole world, or like, I would lose myself without you. And while that might seem like a kind like sentiment to someone who you really care about, it could also be a metaphor that puts pressure on a person to stay in a relationship when they don't want to.
And then the second device we're going to be talking about is bracketing. So similarly to ambiguity, bracketing attempts to misdirect audiences from what a speaker wants to hide or ignore. But rather than doing so by muddling conversation or communication generally, bracketing actually fences off subject matter as untouchable, unchallengeable, or uncriticizable. So for example, in the context of abuse, a person in a relationship or a survivor might bring up something that's of the utmost concern to them, like their well-being, or an abuser's abusive behavior that's been tormenting them or harming them. And so an abuser might use bracketing by acknowledging that, yes, you're hurt. Yes, these things are happening. They might not do so in such an explicit or appropriate or empathetic manner, but they might name that those emotions, that information, but then bracket it off and follow up by ultimately refuting those feelings, misdirecting from what they want to hide or ignore, which is their abusive behavior, which is the experience of the abusee in the situation. And one way that abusers might use bracketing is through the axiomatic statement. And axiomatic statements are very large statements about the nature of reality as a whole. These are statements like, it is what it is. That's just the way the world works. You can't always get what you want. So this totally destabilizes audiences' sense of reasoning when confronting their abuser or perpetrators or people in power, because not only are they apparently wrong for bringing up these situations and their concerns in the first place, but apparently they're also wrong because apparently that's just not the way the world works, right? So that's what these statements ultimately accomplish.
The third rhetorical device that we're going to look at is excusing. And what's important about excusing is that the person using this device acknowledges that there's harm in the situation, but refuses to take any responsibility for their action. So there's a large dismissal of blame here. And this might look like someone saying like, look, I get that you're hurt, but I only did it because I know what's best for you, or I was acting in your own interest. So there's an acknowledgement that something maybe went wrong, but an absolute refusal to take any accountability for it.
And then once again, fairly similarly to excusing, justification also works by dismissing something within the abusive situation. However, it's the opposite of excusing. So rather than acknowledging that a situation is negative and refuting responsibility, justification allows speakers to acknowledge responsibility and actually somewhat take blame. However, they downplay the negative features of a situation, justifying what has occurred and dismissing pain that's caused. So similarly to the example that Noah provided, in the context of abuse, an abuser might say to someone that they're in a relationship that, while yes, these things have happened, yes, I did what I did, it actually wasn't that bad. It was actually for your own good. And you're actually lucky to have me and this relationship because otherwise, where would you be? Right? So that's a kind of justification in that it's dismissing the pain that's caused while still somewhat acknowledging blame. And then you can see how excusing and justification used together all contribute to that sense of ambiguity because they're contradictory. And then the last part of our section is applying all of this to domestic violence and CPSA through two forms, which are gaslighting and trauma bonds that we will continue to refer to throughout this presentation. And we refer to all of these things as violent and traumatic rhetoric. And that is because this is the way that language is used to ultimately cause or perpetuate harm. So first, gaslighting. I'm sure this is a term that many of us are familiar with by now, considering its use in popular media. But for those of you who aren't, gaslighting, generally speaking, is a strategy for controlling someone in such a way that they begin to doubt their own reality. So this is an incredibly dysfunctional form of communication that uses language to warp a person's sense of reality, whether that's their sense of self, the sense that they have of their relationships, the world around them, and the abuse itself, right? So considering the devices that we've talked about thus far, I think excusing and justification are a pretty good example of the ways that gaslighting can be accomplished. And this is because a person can minimize the adversity of someone that they're harming, thereby challenging audiences' perception of the abuse and the legitimacy of their thoughts and needs through making excuses and by justifying the abuse that's occurred, thereby minimizing the person's pain that's been caused.
And we're defining trauma bonds as emotional attachments typically marked by paradoxical complexities of abuse, control, and dependency, and deep feelings of love, admiration, and gratitude in the victim for the abuser. So this is the kind of situation that makes someone believe that they can't leave a situation, even if it's harmful or hurtful, or they don't really want to be there. And that could be either from that like abuse side where they feel like they need to stay for their survival or because they fear for their safety, but also out of that love, gratitude, or admiration. We really see ambiguity as the device that underpins this one because it creates that destabilization of reality and confusion in the survivor, and might create a situation where they go like, but he's good sometimes, or but we have such good times together, he's only like this, like occasionally, and make those excuses to stay. So now we're going to move on to the analysis of Roman Catholic rhetoric using those 4 devices and looking at more specific examples.
Okay, thank you so much. So I am tasked with talking first just about ambiguity. As Noah and Sophia just pointed out, these rhetorical devices are powerful ways of using language that cause things like gaslighting and cause things like the exploitation of trauma bonds in order to keep people closer to an abusive situation. And what I want to do here is go through just a couple brief examples of the ways that Roman Catholic leaders have used these rhetorical devices. So I'm going to be focusing on ambiguity, which again is that unclear language that creates or destabilizes, I should say, the worldview of the listener. So this is Cardinal Timothy Dolan, the Archbishop of New York, one of the most powerful Roman Catholic leaders in the United States. And here's an example of something that he said during an interview when he's describing the way that he interacts with people who come up to him when they are angry about the sexual abuse crisis. He says, when people say to me, we're angry, we're confused, bewildered, frustrated, I think they might expect me to be on the defensive. And I'll say, nice to meet you. So am I. We're all in this together. There's almost a solidarity in the sorrow. Right now, what I want to do is point out just 2 quick things about this and to highlight how he's trying to use ambiguity to create instability in that person's worldview. First, he even acknowledges it, right? I think they might expect me to be on the defensive. So he's intentionally knows that he's meeting an expectation and subverting that expectation, right? Instead of listening to these people, accepting the pain and the anger that he's hearing as this Roman Catholic leader who bears responsibility, he immediately tries to kind of subvert that expectation, right? That's a destabilizing move in that moment where he's really trying to focus on, okay, how am I coming across to these people rather than starting saying, let me just listen to what's going on here in this person. So he's subverting that expectation, which kind of creates that destabilization. Where the ambiguity really comes in is what he's doing here is he's trying to reframe how he's seen in the situation. Right? He's trying to talk about his own feelings as opposed to listening to theirs. Right? So what he's doing is he's challenging the worldview or the perception of the people who have been harmed, and he's refusing in that moment to take responsibility and just listen. Right. So in short, what he's doing is trying to focus the listener on his own feelings as a way of keeping them close. Right. And he even says it at the end. What's his goal? He really wants to be in solidarity with these people. Right. He's more focused on maintaining that closeness and that relationship. Right. So this hopefully has a very clear connection to what we might see in the rhetoric of someone who's a domestic abuser, right? I want to give you a brief quote from Lundy Bancroft, who you'll see much more later on in the presentation. Lundy Bancroft is a therapist who has spent decades working with batterers, trying to help rehabilitate domestic abusers. And he has a book called Why Does He Do That?, which is an amazing book where he kind of goes through the psychology of people who commit abuse. And he says, in that text, he says, the abuser draws you into focusing on the turbulent whirl of his feelings to keep your eyes away from the true cause of his abusiveness, which lies in how he thinks. Right? It's not about the feelings that cause abuse. It's the worldview. It's the values that that person has. And so I think this is an excellent example of Dolan using ambiguity, right, to destabilize a worldview and to kind of hold somebody, try to keep them closer to him. Another very, very powerful form of ambiguous language, as was pointed out previously, is the metaphor. This is Robert Barron, the Bishop of Winona Rochester, and he wrote a short book called Letter to a Suffering Church, which is where a lot of our examples come from. This came out a few years ago, and in this book, Robert Barron is basically giving his reasons why people shouldn't leave the church. Right? And one of the things he does in this letter is he uses 2 metaphors that he takes from the letters of St. Paul, and he really, really emphasizes them as a way of trying to get people to stay. He says, the treasure, and that's one of the first metaphors, the treasure is the grace of Christ, the new life made available through the dying and rising of Jesus. And the vessels, that's the other metaphor, the vessels are the deeply flawed, fragile, and morally suspect people who have received that grace and who are endeavoring to live that new life. We don't stay because of the vessels, we stay because of the treasure. Now, that metaphor, I think, is a way of using ambiguity to try to determine how his listeners are going to perceive the abusive situation that they're in. Right? It's very similar. You've probably heard the metaphor that I detest. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Right? What's the point of that metaphor? Well, it's really helpful for the speaker to be able to separate the things that are harmful from the things they want to keep, that they want to maintain. Right? So when I say the treasure in the Catholic Church, oh, the treasure, we stay for the treasure, what he's doing is he is destabilizing the perception of the person who's listening to him, saying, no, the thing you're upset about, that's just the vessel, right? The thing that really matters is a separate thing over here, this treasure. And that's why you stay. When, of course, the people that he's speaking to know fully well, you can't just separate those things. So, for instance, one of the treasures he really emphasizes is the Eucharist. And he says some just flat out false things about how the Eucharist is a treasure that we have to maintain, and it cannot be tainted by the horrible actions of these Catholic leaders. When, of course, anybody who is going through PTSD or moral injury or moral distress because of the sexual abuse crisis, they know fully well that they've sat in a church before at the Eucharist and had very, very difficult experiences. Right? You can't just separate those things out. Right? So I think that these two examples are good, brief examples of ambiguity, ways that language can be used in order to destabilize a person's worldview, kind of make them feel uncertain, that then drives them back towards the authority of the bishop, right? So by creating a sense of uncertainty, a bishop can reinforce their own authority by accentuating the layperson's perceived dependence on the clerical guidance. As with domestic violence or intimate partner violence, this feeling of dependence triggers trauma bonds, thereby becoming a powerful motivation to refuse to leave the abusive relationship. Or, to use the words of Caitlin Casasa, who is a social worker who studies trauma bonding within domestic violence, she says, in place of the self, the victim then becomes dependent on the perpetrator, internalizing the perpetrator's worldviews. The perpetrator is idealized, and the victim takes on the blame and guilt of any toxicity or exploitation in the relationship while seeking to please the perpetrator. Right? Now, while that's, of course, about domestic violence, I think there is a very analogous thing happening within the way that the Catholic leaders are speaking in a way that tries to keep people close and to replace their perception with their own. Right? So now we're going to shift from ambiguity over to bracketing, and for that, I'm going to hand it over to Maya. You got a mic? Awesome.
Okay, so as it was previously defined, bracketing is a way to fence off the conversation and for the speaker to manipulate or control what is being said. So here's a quote from Pope John Paul II. We cannot forget the power of Christian conversion, that radical decision to turn away from sin and back to God, which reaches to depths of a person's soul and can work extraordinary change. So what this quote is doing is it's entirely defining the conversation through language that is used through the church. Note sin and God and soul and Christian tradition. So when we use the word sin, we're defining CPSA through clerical language, which now dictates that it is a sin instead of a crime. And what we can note is that Pope Francis was the first pope to recognize CPSA as crime, thus not bracketing the conversation as CPSA is a sin and exclusively defining it through clerical language. Second, we have Bishop Robert Barron, who quotes, "Therefore, let me state it bluntly. The Eucharist is the single most important reason for staying faithful to the Church. You can't find it anywhere else, and no wickedness on the part of the priests or bishops can affect it." First, this quote notes that the Church is more important than an individual's experience with CPSA. And what we can recognize is that language is a tool used to maintain power. stating that the Eucharist is the single most important reason for staying faithful to the church, brackets off the conversation from CPSA and steers it towards why someone should remain in the church and that can lead to invalidation of an individual's experience with CPSA. So, through the use of bracketing, a bishop can fence off aspects of the conversation by making the church the most important thing in the conversation. This muddles the experience, this muddles the conversation between an individual's experience and from the laity to the powerful positions of the church. This ignores and hides experiences. As with IPV, interpersonal violence, and domestic abuse, this rhetorical strategy weakens a listener's response and defense. The therapist Lundy Bancroft quotes, "His tricks largely rely on getting you to look off in the wrong direction, distracting your attention so you won't notice where the real action is. He draws you into focusing on the turbulent world of his feelings to keep your eyes turned away from the true causes of his abusiveness, which lies in how he thinks." This implies that there's an implicit problem with steering a conversation away from the reality and using your power dynamic to control what the goal of the conversation should be. This in turn can perpetuate gaslighting and traumatic bonding, and Meg will speak more on how rhetorical strategies like excusing and justification can do so.
All right, so first of all, I want to talk about the difference between excusing and justification. Since these two, they play a similar role as they both gaslight and disrupt the perception of the victim's reality. However, when we're talking about excusing, it's recognizing the hurt, but then dismissing the blame of it and putting it on someone else. Whereas justification, they're also recognizing that hurt and blame, but they're arguing that it happened for a reason, or arguing that there's a silver lining, which I'm gonna talk about a little bit later. So for the first example of excusing, I wanna point to Pope John Paul II, and this is in the context of an address to cardinals of the United States in 2002. So this is very fresh off the big scandal, the media coverage of the scandal that's going on. So Pope John Paul II said, "The abuse of the young is a grave symptom of a crisis affecting not only the church, but society as a whole. It is a deep-seated crisis of sexual morality, even of human relationships, and its prime victims are the family and the young." So here what we're seeing is a lot of mix. This section is going to bring a lot of things together. So first of all, we have the excusing part. It's not the fault of the clergy. He recognizes that it was bad, but what he's doing is he's shifting that language towards a larger issue, putting it on the crisis of modernity, as some people call it. And even this is reflected in some of the rhetoric that Benedict XVI writes about and says, which we talk about in our larger paper. But here he's bracketing off the blame from the church and instead placing that blame on a larger society. So he's really disrupting the reality of the situation and invalidating where that abuse really came from, and that the church cannot be the sole blame of this societal issue. It really pushes the blame off of them and then places it onto another individual or a larger society. And then second, I want to move on to justification. And this is going to be a two-part quote. So there's a reminder of justification in that it's not excusing. Instead, it's a silver lining, or it's talking about it wasn't that bad. So with justification, I'm going to bring it back to Robert Barron. And in this chapter, this is a specific chapter in the book, Letter to a Suffering Church. So in this, the chapter is titled, "We've Been Here Before." So just that title, there's actually a fallacy going on there called historical presentism. And the historian David Fisher describes historical presentism as a complex anachronism in which the antecedent in a narrative series is falsified by being denied or interpreted in terms of the consequent. So in reality, this is kind of like, just because it happened in the past doesn't mean that it's the exact same situation now. And when we think about that chapter, it's basically just a relaying of scandal and crisis in the Catholic Church, which you may assume means that they're going to talk about how this keeps happening. However, it's absolutely not the situation. When Robert Barron is talking about it, instead, he says, this is the way that the world is. This is how it's been, and this is how it will be. We're talking about the 11th century here, but it doesn't investigate the power relations by the clerics. Instead, it normalizes it when we're talking about that axiomatic statement. So this is the way it is, and this is the way that it will be. Axiomatic statements are the way the world works, and it serves to invalidate the abuse that's going on and trying to normalize it. So the first half of this quote that I'm going to talk about, in that notorious 11th century when the papacy was so compromised, sexual abuse of young people by the clergy was also rampant. So in this, it's serving to minimize the significance and the trauma going on in that situation. Also in this, it really fails to recognize that people like Lundy Bancroft and other social workers have argued that when there's abuse going on, particularly sexual abuse, it's not about sexuality. It's not about the crisis of modernity and morality. Instead, it's about an abuse of power. And the quotes that we've gone through, especially in this section with John Paul II, it really does not understand that. It refuses to acknowledge the power dynamics and instead places it purely on sexuality and a sense of immorality in a larger society. So this is going to be a quote later in that chapter. And here we are seeing a lot going on. We have metaphor, but let me read the quote first. Hearing these dark tales was a bit like receiving an immunization. Having taken in the very worst of church history, we could even more clearly understand that there is nevertheless something good, even indestructibly good, about the mystical body of Christ. This is where we get to that silver lining concept of justification. Barron uses it here as the mystical body of Christ, indestructibly good. And other popes and clerics have talked about purification and how this is a time for purification. It fails to recognize that this is a time of crisis, that this is a time of trauma, and instead tries to turn it around into something positive. However, it's a really strange way to view it. Even the use of the metaphor immunization, it really forces people to think that, okay, you know all of this, so you shouldn't be affected by this now. Once again, axiomatic statement. This is the way things have been, and this is the way that they will continue to be. Kind of like we talked about earlier, you have no idea how good you have it. Yes, this abuse is continuing, but we have that silver lining. It's refusing to acknowledge the desire of people to want to leave, to really have any sort of reckoning with the trauma that they've had since, as Robert Barron says, there's the mystical body of Christ. We're seeing that metaphor continued, and it's similar to the concept of DV, something that Bancroft talks about as, yes, it's been a hard time, but we're stronger in the end. You've gone through this, you have that immunization, you should be used to it now. Now you can be resistant to it. However, that concept just absolutely minimized the real harm done by actions such as these by clerical authority. So I'm going to summarize that with excusing and justification. Together, excuse and justification have been utilized by Catholic leaders in a manner that allows them to simultaneously appear to accept responsibility while mitigating blame and eschewing calls for clerical reform. It's an interesting dynamic that we have here, where they're not just straight out denying it. They do accept that it happened. However, they refuse to take that full blame. And in this, like the quote that I'm going to bring up from Bancroft, it serves to gaslight. It serves to gaslight the laity, not just the people who are survivors of CPSA, but also the reaction of the greater Catholic Church that there was betrayal there. Someone that they trusted, people that they trusted, refused to acknowledge it for so long. It changes their perception of the reality of the situation by excusing and justifying it. This quote by Bancroft really highlights just half and half the concept of justification and the concept of excusing. Bancroft writes, "A batterer may strive to manipulate his partner's perception of his actions, or to create confusion about the causes or meanings of the incident." So first, justification, it's that perceptions part. It's that it's a silver lining, it's not as bad as you thought. This has been happening. That's the first half of it. And then the latter half of the quote is excusing, to create confusions about the causes or meaning of the incidents. It's not power. No, it's sexual immorality. It's a larger societal issue that the church cannot be solely to blame for. So in these excusing and justification, we're really starting to see a sort of dynamic where there's acknowledging of blame, but not quite acceptance of it. And as this is the last section we're going to talk about, you really see all of them coming together. You see that ambiguity with the metaphors. You see that bracketing off with the refusal to talk about the power dynamics, with only talking about, yes, this was historic, this has always been going on. But it's not our fault. It hasn't been that bad. So now that we've gotten through the absolutely bleak part of the presentation, okay, it's been a bit bleak, but there are solutions. It's not just going to end with like burn it all down. So I want to pass it over to Ben and Kate, who have investigated a lot about trauma-informed care and trauma-informed rhetoric and how it can lead to a greater change in church culture and work towards healing and avoiding the process of re-traumatization, gaslighting, and the persistence of trauma bonds that has occurred.
All right, so like Meg said, everything that we've kind of talked about has been leading up to what do we do about it and how can we change that language to stop the perpetuation of that re-traumatization, but then also create an environment that can do better about introducing trauma within our conversations, especially within any sort of like church community. So we've kind of coined the term trauma-informed rhetoric. So trauma-informed rhetoric kind of came from the larger idea of the trauma-informed approach, which is one that was cultivated to, again, bring that idea of no longer causing a space that reduces re-victimization and re-traumatization. So this trauma-informed approach has been used across many different organizations and systems themselves, and each been implied and manipulated to fit that system correctly to serve that greater purpose of reducing re-traumatization. So again, it addresses that topic of gaslighting and exploiting trauma bonds, which is something that we took in consideration for a large part of what the principles of trauma-informed rhetoric that we're going to go through next. But after that trauma-informed approach came into an idea, most notably in practice, we see it through the usage of trauma-informed care, which we can see in medical settings and school settings. Medically, we can see trauma-informed care being used if a practitioner has a patient coming in that they know have had a negative experience in a surgery or has had a really hard time in a medical setting. And so going back into the same office, or maybe they experienced a really traumatizing event, is going to directly change the way that they're able to participate and feel like they can function within that space. We can also see it within school systems for children who have had multiple different intersectional areas of their life coming in and going to school and learning about topics that might be triggering within their own experiences and their own trauma, and how we can create an environment within the classroom, but also the larger educational system as a whole to fit the needs of every child that's sitting in front of them. So from all of that, we're taking the trauma-informed approach and applying it through the lens of rhetoric, which we're going to talk about the 4 different principles that we have coined. So trauma-informed rhetoric, like I said, all of the trauma-informed approach can be defined in a multitude of ways, from like 6 principles, 5 pillars, 4 R's, 4 C's, whatever you can think of. So we looked at all of those and cultivated the most important aspects of them and how they would function well within rhetoric. So we came up with these 4 principles. The first one is safety, which is most importantly understood that it cannot stand alone. With the next 3 principles that we're going to talk about, safety is only able to function, and these next 3 principles are only able to serve the purpose that they are intended to if there's a safe environment physically, psychologically, but also spiritually. In order for these principles to fully function with the purpose, there has to be an understanding and an environment that supports that and motivates that to grow with the desired purpose. So in trauma-informed rhetoric, this foundation that safety has allows for rhetoric to be received in the way that it's intended. The second principle we've titled Empowerment Through Agency. So the distinction to make here is the difference between agency and choice and how they work together. For many survivors of abuse and sexual assault themselves, the ability to choose in any sort of way, from what they wear in the morning to what they eat, to being able to report, to who they can talk to, all of those things are most notably removed and thus silenced the survivor amidst their experiences. So returning that sense of agency back to the survivor, giving giving them that feeling of being able to choose, and then following up with the actual choice itself, right? Choice functions underneath the larger umbrella of agency, but both of them have to be able to function together in order to restill that empowerment to the survivor themselves. So when we see this functioning within trauma-informed rhetoric, we can see that it directly reduces the bracketing that we've talked about earlier through addressing some trauma bonds that we've discussed. And then the third one is communication and transparency. So the goal of this one is to have honest, clear, and constant communication between the community and the leadership, to break down that power dynamic and to really show what's happening and what's going on with all levels of the church and that community that we're talking about. When there's clear and honest communication, it reduces that ambiguity that we're talking about, and it allows for the environment to have a part in the say of what's happening, and an understanding and an awareness of the decisions that are being made affecting the community, but also leading towards the needs and the necessities of that community coming from the people who are currently experiencing it. So through trauma-informed rhetoric, we can see it reduces the ambiguity and then addresses gaslighting itself. And then the fourth one is a social work loved term called intersectionality, which really strives to see the whole person with all of their intersectional identities, all of their parts. So intersectionality can see the identities of gender, sexuality, geography, history, culture, any sort of part of a person that makes them who they are and what they have experienced. So if we take this intersectionality and see that, we can also see the ripple effect that trauma has on a person, that they might have experienced it in a school system, but they could be walking in a grocery store and picking up the same food that a kid could have had a snack that day in the same class that they experienced the trauma, that it ripples effects into every avenue of their life, no matter their age and no matter where they are. And noticing this larger picture of what trauma does to a person, we're able to understand the language that's best to be used to reduce that re-traumatization when we're conversing with them. So through trauma-informed rhetoric, we directly reduce excusing and justification. So now Ben and I are kind of going to go through our beloved chart, and we're going to talk about the rhetorical devices that we've all kind of gone through before and how we can address those through the 4 principles that I just discussed. And then bring up a negative example of clergy perpetrated sexual abuse and how we can make that trauma-informed.
Yeah, so in part of having this conversation and using trauma-informed rhetoric, we're really applying it in a way that's conversational, so this back and forth kind of explains that. And so the first one we're going to look at is ambiguity. And going back to that quote from Timothy Dolan, nice to meet you. So my, we're all in this together. There's almost a solidarity in the sorrow. We can touch on that ambiguity in the idea of what does it mean to be in this together, right? What is that this that we're talking about? And what does it mean to be in solidarity with that sorrow? And so there's this ambiguity going on that really makes it hard to understand what's being talked about, and it really kind of takes away from that point. And that really touches on this idea of principle 3, which is communication and transparency, right? How do we have this, or how do we present this conversation in a way that's understandable and transparent in the communication happening? And so what would it look like to actually apply that to this conversation?
So with applying that to this conversation, Timothy Dolan can address the same idea of solidarity and that point, importance of solidarity within this, but in a trauma-informed way where we say, you know, so many others have had similar experiences to you, which can be a real resource for you. So here are some resources, both within the church and without the church, and know that I'm here to support you in whatever way that I can, knowing that I am a symbol of the hurt and the pain that you have experienced. But here are some other avenues to help address and other resources for people who have actually experienced what you've been through and who can understand more the anger and the frustration and the sadness that you are currently feeling.
And the second one we can look at is this idea of bracketing, right? Going back to that, of removing the person from the conversation, and specifically with Robert Barron's treasure and vessel analogy we were looking at, where he's really taking the laity out of the conversation. He is saying that you have to stay for the treasure. And this is really removing a lot of your ability to have agency in that. He's saying that you can only seek redemption through the church, through this treasure. And by doing that, you're really preventing that conversation from happening by saying that it's an untouchable subject. And so how can we apply this idea of empowerment through agency to really allow this conversation to happen?
So one pretty good example from Pope Benedict XVI addresses just the recognition that there is no ability to choose. If we can just acknowledge that that can't happen for somebody, then we can acknowledge that something more needs to be done than re-looking at the symbol over and over again, trying to have a different outcome. So in a letter and a note that we kind of went in further with our last presentation, Pope Benedict XVI gave an example of a woman who was an altar server who has experienced clerical sexual abuse, and at the beginning of every assault she was told by the priest the words of consecration, which is the highest part of the mass. And so every time that this woman can no longer hear the very words of consecration without re-experiencing again all of the horrific distress of her abuse, she can no longer see the consecration of the Eucharist as something that is positive and holy and as beautiful as a church wants and tells us it is, and that we believe that it is, because of the abuse that she's been through. And so that symbol can no longer serve the purpose that the church intends. So how can we change that environment so that way she can experience the healing and the beauty and the pain all at once without having to relive over and over again that abuse that she occurred? So simply by Pope Benedict stating that she has no ability to look at the same symbol that caused her so much pain and now suddenly see greatness and beauty, that by acknowledging that, he acknowledges that she has no agency and can later then address the ability to regain and empower that agency and choice.
And then the last one we can look at is this quote from Robert Barron. Prophets didn't cut and run. The prophets spoke out. That's all of our responsibility, all of us who bear the prophetic charism. And this is really touching on that idea of excusing and justification. And the excusing part of it here is that it's this idea of cut and run, right? He's saying that it is the fault of those who left the church. It is their problem. And he's shifting the blame off of the clergy and on to the actual people who left the church. And so how can we speak to intersectionality in addressing this?
Yeah, so one really great example that approaches this intersectionalness is by Bishop Edgar da Cunha. He stated in a 3-minute video to his congregation addressing the CPSA. He said that, again, I apologize and express my deepest sorrow to the survivors and their families. I want to once again pledge our commitment and resolve to keeping children safe, to holding perpetrators accountable, and to support with healing to all who have been hurt by CPSA. Right before this, he states that, it takes a lot of courage to report and to reach out for help, but it even takes a lot of courage to visit the website to then report, that it takes courage to do a small step forward. And so by acknowledging the barriers that intersect within somebody's experiences in their life, reaching out for support, going to a website, he also acknowledges that there is an impact of the trauma not only on the survivor, but also on their families and how that functions within their own culture and their environment. He acknowledges that there is the protecting the children's side, but there's also holding the perpetrators accountable, that this intersectional awareness allows for a greater understanding of the ways that this trauma has greatly rippled out and affected all avenues of their inner working lives, and how we can then address each of those individually, but also as a collective whole.
And then to kind of tie back into that point of intersectionality, there's a really important part of here about that idea of church culture, right? And that the Catholic Church is vast in the people in it and in their identities that make up the church, right? And so when we look at this intersectionality, we have to look at the conversations that are happening and how the conversations between leaders and laity, between the laity, and just in the everyday life of the people in the community of the church really influence this larger idea of the church culture, right? And when we use these rhetorical devices, they really influence the way that the conversation is had around CPSA. And the important part of that is that we see these devices being used in a way that's rhetorically abusive, right? We see these perpetuating trauma or causing trauma. And in order to actually minimize this re-traumatization and to actually get to a point where this conversation can happen, we really have to address how the church leadership specifically is talking, right? And the reason that we focus on them is that they have a very specific part in the church where they have a very large audience and that their words carry a lot of weight. But that doesn't mean that it's only the church leadership's responsibility. Even in the way that the laity talk to each other and everyone in the community talk about this, it's important that they frame the conversation in a way that allows the safety to happen, to allow this foundation to be built where a conversation can actually be had and where we can talk about CPSA in a way that's productive and allows for a conversation where people can actually heal and where it can actually move forwards. And with this kind of application, that's where we really see trauma-informed rhetoric coming through, is being that way that we can have this conversation, because these are tough conversations to have, but they're very much needed conversations to have. And most importantly, we need to have them in a way where it can actually be a productive conversation, where people actually feel safe to have these conversations, and where healing can actually happen. And with that, I want to pass it to Dr. Turnbloom to give us a conclusion and introduce our respondent.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So our research project then has been an attempt to understand the cultures of abuse that are alive and well in Roman Catholicism by better understanding how domestic abuse happens. Domestic abuse is not the result of one person losing control of their emotions and lashing out. And the sexual abuse crisis is not the result of a few bad priests who lost control of themselves. Abuse finds its roots in the way that we think about the world. Abuse comes from cultural values that we are exposed to through our communities and traditions. Cultural values like ownership, entitlement, and control. And here I want to give you one last quote from Lundy Bancroft. It's my favorite quote from the whole book. He says, "Abuse grows from attitudes and values, not feelings. The roots are ownership. The trunk is entitlement, and the branches are control." Now, while this is applied to domestic violence, I think it is a beautiful description of clericalism in the Roman Catholic Church as well. Clericalism is a pervasive culture that sees clerics as divine shepherds who are charged with protecting their beloved yet deeply inferior flock of sheep. Again, metaphors are very telling. Pope Francis has repeatedly described Roman Catholicism's struggle with clericalism as a struggle with rigidity and refusal to learn from the laity. In short, clericalism is about ownership, entitlement, and control. The primary goal of our research project has been to help people recognize the rhetorical devices that one can expect to encounter when a violent culture tries to protect itself from being recognized and changed. Speaking through the voices of its most faithful and most loyal adherents, an abusive culture will employ ambiguous metaphors in order to confuse. It will bracket in order to distract its critics from the ongoing failures it cannot defend but cannot live without. It will make excuses and scapegoat the straw men it wishes were at fault. And it will justify itself, insisting that the harm is not as bad as the critics are claiming, especially when compared to how wonderful things could be if people could just trust its divine wisdom. In short, we can expect to hear rhetoric that refuses to acquiesce power. The rhetoric of abusers, domestic and clerical, is the rhetoric of a culture that is essentially oppressive and violent. And as Audre Lorde reminds us, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So, we hope that this presentation can help everyone affected by the sex abuse crisis, which is everyone connected to the Catholic Church in any way, to more readily recognize the master's violent rhetorical tools. We also hope that the trauma-informed rhetorical principles we described might aid in the dismantling and the uprooting of this violent tree of clerical abuse, which continues to crucify all those affected by the sexual abuse crisis. So, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to, that's the end of our presentation, but I want to now introduce our respondent, Lex Crawford. This past summer, our lab had the pleasure of meeting Lex when we were interviewing people from around the Portland area who work in sexual abuse prevention. And Lex was kind enough to come to UP and talk with us for a few hours about her work, and we thought she would be a perfect respondent tonight. So just a brief introduction. Lex is the Outreach and Training Coordinator for Clackamas Women's Services, and she has been with the organization since 2021. Prior to joining CWS, Lex provided services in the Gorge through developing a violence prevention curriculum for K-12 classrooms, teaching healthy relationships workshops for adults, and supporting community college students in reaching their academic and career goals. She strongly believes in the power of shared knowledge and challenging the status quo as we work toward a safer world for all. In her free time, Lex enjoys watching college football, Roll Tide, crocheting and cross-stitching, reading fantasy novels, and playing outside with her kiddo. Please join me in welcoming Lex Crawford.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to Dr. Turnbloom and the Chirp Lab students for having me. It was a true delight to sit with them this past summer and hear their passions about this topic, as well as be able to share what we all are doing at CWS. This is incredibly well done research. It's important. It's timely. I can't emphasize enough how important research that is actually from this decade is to our work. Most of the stats that we have and that we work off of are anywhere from 5 to 15 years old, just simply because of the way that research works and because of the funding that is lacking in that research. So I'm extremely thankful for all of the work that you've put in. I'm going to steal a lot of this, but I will credit you, I promise. It's fantastic work, so thank you so much for doing that. Personally, this is a topic that's very close to my heart. I myself, along with many of my loved ones, have been harmed by this kind of rhetoric within various Christian faith systems. And professionally, this research directly mirrors what we see at CWS and what our other fellow social service providers see from survivors every single day. So I'd like to share some of that with you to connect this research to what we see in the field all the time. Part of my job as the outreach and training coordinator is challenging that narrative, challenging this rhetoric around the experience and aftermath of domestic and sexual violence. In my trainings, we talk extensively about how the beliefs we have, the words we use, and the frameworks through which we see the world have a lasting and often unintentional impact, as you all noted. I choose to believe that most people don't consciously and intentionally want to harm another human, but we are socialized into these narratives that tell us certain behavior and beliefs are either not harmful at all, or if they are harmful, then it's justified for the sake of the greater good. If we ever want to see violence end in our world, we must change the things that we think, believe, and say about our neighbors. Social dominance theory is a psychological concept that notes that these socially constructed hierarchies and the discrimination inherent within them are propped up and perpetuated by various myths that we've accepted as a society. These myths tell us who is superior and worthy of protection, respect, belief, fear, accessibility, as well as who is inferior and thus to be doubted, questioned, violated, belittled, and excluded. We often refer to these myths with the isms, of course, racism, sexism, classism, and so on. They also dictate how we are expected to respond. So in cases of domestic and sexual violence, which we know are most often gender-based experiences, we see survivors constantly lambasted for not fighting back, not running away, not yelling for help, among many other things. And we can point again back to these myths and narratives that tell us that this is the wrong way to respond. We should run away, we should yell out, we should seek help faster. For many survivors and their loved ones, their faith is a pillar of strength. They find community, healing, and a place to simply be in the arms of their congregation and the beauty of their doctrine. When then faced with such rhetoric as you have seen tonight, these survivors often find themselves feeling as though the rug has been pulled out from under them. We see this constantly. The place and the people they expected to be there to support them through some of the worst moments of their lives are repeating the same exact things that their abusers say to them. I'm hurt too. The relationship is too important and too special for you to leave. It's your responsibility to fix things. All relationships have hard times. You'll never find someone who will love you like I do. Intentionally or not, this is mirroring abusers directly. We also must consider how the importance of language is not simply in what we say, but also in what we don't say. By responding to domestic and sexual violence in the ways that have been discussed here, these faith leaders are communicating a very clear message. That message is this: the church's mission is more important than your pain and your humanity. This is exactly the same message that survivors hear from their abusers every day. My interests, my desires, my comfort, and my reputation are all more important than you. The survivor's not the only one who recognizes this. The abuser does as well. Not only is this kind of rhetoric directly harming survivors, it is simultaneously comforting the abuser in knowing that they will not face any consequences or substantial responsibility from the church for their actions. When we begin to change the narrative, however, I believe we will see this shift. As we understand all people to be of equal value and worthiness, there is no room for dismissing abuse or treating abuse like it is simply a fact of life. When we truly believe that every person is equal to one another, we must take strong, determinate action against abuse. This includes being clear, explicit, and firm about both the horrors of this behavior as well as our responsibility in its perpetuation and how we'll work to end it on our part. There are so many options for responding in significantly more healthy and helpful ways. You've seen many of those tonight that were wonderful. But I want to leave you with a really simple option. One of the biggest questions that I get, no matter who I'm with, no matter how long someone's been working in a similar field, is, what do I do? Someone has shared something with me and I have no clue what to say. I freeze. I don't know what to do. I don't want to hurt them more. So let me give you some tools for your toolkit. This is something we teach all of our new advocates, all of our volunteers, all of our community members, and it's very, very simple. When someone shares with you about violence they've experienced, there are 4 very simple things that you can say every single time, no matter who they are, no matter what the circumstances are. These 4 things are, number 1, I believe you. Survivors are often told that not only are they crazy, their reality is not real, but also that other people will immediately doubt and question them. So saying I believe you is incredibly healing right off the bat. Number 2, you did not deserve the things you experienced. Again, survivors are often told that they've done something wrong, that it's their fault. They internalize a lot of these things. It's very, very common. So telling someone they didn't deserve that may be the first time that they've heard that. Number 3, it's completely normal to feel however you are feeling in this moment. Violence of any kind is confusing. It is not the same for every person. Trauma looks incredibly different for every single human being, and our emotions can feel like they're betraying us. Our bodies can feel like they're betraying us. So reminding someone that the feelings they are feeling is completely normal is incredibly helpful. And finally, what can I do to support you? We want to make sure that folks know that we're here for them, but we don't want to pretend like we know what will actually help them. So making ourselves available and asking what you can do is incredibly important for survivors. And having some idea of what some resources are as well, kind of in your back pocket, can be super helpful. These 4 things immediately move us away from dismissing, trivializing, justifying, and excusing the violence. You cannot say, truly, I believe you, and then go back and justify that violence. Resting on this foundation of belief, validation, and support begins the process of removing the power that all of this harmful rhetoric has wielded over survivors in support of abusers for generations. A safer world is possible, but it requires every one of us to examine our own beliefs and change our mindsets in the service of those who are truly being harmed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lex. So that brings our presentation to a conclusion. We have time for question and answer, and just want to let everybody know that this whole presentation has been taped and it's going to be available. So, you know, there's something you want to revisit, that'll be an opportunity for you. So, yeah, I'll just open it up for questions from the audience. And if we could, I always, the presentation I'm part of, I like to prioritize especially student questions or questions from anybody perhaps from the larger community area. So maybe if we could start with those populations first, and then, of course, if there's any staff or faculty who have questions, we can get to that as well. So any student or community member questions, and you can direct it to any of the presenters that you'd like to. Doesn't even be questions either. It can also be comments, thoughts that you have. So, thanks. I'll bring the mic to you.
Hello. I'm going to direct my question to Kate. So, you don't have to stand up if you don't want to. Okay. So, there's this documentary on Netflix that I automatically think of. It's called The Keepers. So, a nun was murdered in Baltimore in 1969. This is a really hard topic. So essentially, this one priest and a few other priests, all men, were administration of an all-girls Catholic high school. They were known to sexually abuse the students for who knows how long. I was wondering, have you seen that documentary? What are your thoughts? And what do you think about this topic going forward as a social worker?
Thanks for the question. It's kind of scary. I unfortunately have not seen that documentary, but I will say I had a similar experience within my own high school, and I can kind of address it through the lens of my experience and the bishop's response and stuff like that. Is that an okay approach here? Okay, great. We had a chaplain at my Catholic high school that was accused of sexual assault towards many students, but also in his local parish as well. And I will say that the address that our Diocese of Phoenix in Arizona had sent to our university or our school about it solely addressed the fact that he acknowledged that there was violence that had occurred on our campus, and he had been removed from the location and moved to a new parish that didn't have students near them. And I will say, even in high school, reading that I was so angry and so frustrated at the fact that it was a letter that got sent, that there was no real conversation happening within the students. There was also no access to resources for the students who might have had a good relationship with that priest and now have this whole new lens to view him through. But then there was also no real understanding of what was going to be done as the perpetrator of such abuse, how he was going to be held accountable. So there was a lot of emotional distress going on and moral distress that we had talked about in our last paper as well. And I think experiencing that and understanding that lens, what I wish they would have done is, one, use trauma-informed rhetoric when they were writing this letter, but also had those access to resources for students and approached it in a much different way, which I think this trauma-informed rhetoric and what we've talked about now is one step in applying a larger systemic change, that if language is being able to be used, then the resources that will follow them will have that same language, that same intention behind it, hopefully creating a more helpful tool and resource for students.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, I don't really know who specifically to aim my question at, so I guess just for the panel in general, what can specifically the University of Portland faculty do to increase their usage of this trauma-informed rhetoric to better serve the community of the university?
Anybody else want to talk about that? No? I think conversations, we have to not be scared of just any little mistake that we might make, right? Because I think that's a big problem is as a professor who is very often looked at like, oh, well, you're an expert, you should know exactly what you're doing all the time. The second I'm in a situation where I don't feel like I'm being perceived that way, it's very easy for me to just shut down and just run away. And so I think it's important for us, especially as faculty colleagues, to speak to one another in a way that says you're learning, you're in process, you're going to make mistakes, but we all want to make less of them. So let's have a conversation together about ways that we can improve, right? I think speaking from my experience at UP for the last 7 or 8 years now, I'm surrounded by colleagues with an immense amount of goodwill, people that really do want to learn. And I think that the more that we engage in conversations about trauma-informed rhetoric, and frankly, the more that we then learn from our students, which is what I love about this project, is that these trauma-informed rhetoric principles are not something I came up with. It's something that they came up with, and distilled research that they did, and it's been really helpful to me. And so I think there's no easy answer to that, but I do think it is, on one hand, it's about having conversations, learning from wherever we can learn from, but also it takes courage to be able to say, I'm going to continue to make mistakes, and that's scary, but it's not nearly as scary as if I just went along acting like I didn't make mistakes, leaving people's pain in my wake, right? So that's how I'd answer that.
I also want to add, I'm sorry, before we move on, I also think that it's important to just like, kind of like Lex was saying, that acknowledging that there's that hurt and that pain that exists there, and that while it might have happened in the past, that violence still occurs. I think that it's typically a conversation that doesn't actually talk about the term of violence and hurt and pain, that those are languages that are never actually included in these conversations. And I think just taking the time to say, I believe you, and that these violences have occurred and they still do today. I wish that was a part of the conversation that UP included, and not just directly to the problem solving, but taking the time to acknowledge and really mull over in that for a bit.
Hi, my question actually was for Lex. Is there ever a time in your journey, in your career, where you sort of felt not entirely discouraged, but just like oh my God, this is crazy what's happening in the world, and how do you sort of deal with that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think for anybody who's thinking about going into any sort of work with humans in general, you need to be prepared for that. Here's a mistake that, please don't make this mistake. When I first started in this work, I took it way too personally, and it became, if I'm not using every moment of my day, whether I'm on the clock or not, to learn and to grow and to do more and to know more and to come up with more ideas, then I'm failing in my job and I'm failing the people that I'm working with. And what that ended up doing is I was coming home from 8 hours every single day of going in classrooms and hearing horrific things that students were experiencing, doing research, just really being inundated by all of this. I'm coming home and then I'm listening to podcasts about it, and I'm watching shows about it, and I'm reading books about it, and it became too much. So yes, there are times where it can feel overwhelming, but you have to balance it out. It has to be an intentional balance, because if you don't, you will drown in it. That's the truth of the matter. You'll drown. But that's why our support systems are here. That's why your friends, your family, all the people in your life, that's why comedy shows exist. That's why. So I would say, yes, it can get very overwhelming, but you have to consider the other things in life. I say a lot of times in our trainings that you can't pour from an empty cup. And so if you're completely emptied out because of that overwhelm, you can't serve the people around you. So just take care of yourself, and it's going to be okay. I promise.
Thank you. Any others? Quinn, you have one?
I have like a softly pragmatic question that's mostly just kind of speculative. As someone who's kind of toed up to the doors of the Catholic Church and like gawked at how big they are, how do you envision this sort of change happening in the people in power? You know, it seems pretty hard to get someone like Bishop Barron to be like, can you use some trauma-informed rhetoric, please? And it also seems like quite a burden on the laity, but also like, is that where is it grassroots? Like, I'm like, where do you go? How do you make it happen? Like, hot dog, let's do it, but where?
Okay. Great question, Quinn. Thank you so much. I want it to be from top down. I think that, like Ben had discussed about the importance of church culture, that they're the ones that kind of set the bar. They're the ones that set the image and the motto of what we're supposed to follow. And so I feel like it would work best if it came from top down. And I think that when Meg was talking about even just the change in language from sin to crime itself, acknowledging that, you know, he was able to state that there is a real hurt and a real pain that goes beyond the church, that it goes into our legal system and it goes into all of these intersectional spaces, that if we continue to use language within that, and Pope Francis continues to do that, the goal is that other bishops will take on to that motto and to that same idea and framework and going down. I think a lot of it comes from also just like a larger cultural understanding. If that language is something that is widely used, it becomes a norm, and we're able to change the societal norm in which we produce that language and then thus impacts our reaction. So I think it's a both and sort of answer, but we'll see.
Thank you. I find this presentation wonderful and really good. I want to include something else in here, though, that picks up on the keepers, because I have watched that, because some of you may know I am a Dominican sister and a member of a congregation. There is more to be said about this that's missing up here, and I think you need another picture, Dave. And the picture is also Pope Francis. And the reality of that is we want to see all the goodness of this, which there is a lot of good. But this whole situation is systemic, and it intersects with sexism, because just last week, and I have been following this case because I know these people, the sister that was repeatedly raped by the bishop in India, and he was brought to trial. And there's layers of trial in India. He was exonerated by the first layer and said, you know, it's okay, you were cleared of all of this. And there is Francis embracing him. And there was never a word about the pain endured by the woman in this church and by the community that has supported her, that has ostracized her, been ostracized by her own community. Internal misogyny that you have here. And so we cannot talk about the sex abuse and pedophilia and anything else without addressing the outright sexism in the church. And in everyone, there's a part of this. And that cannot be erased, even with all the good intention of Pope Francis.
Did anybody want to respond
I
to
think
that?
that spoke for itself.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like the intersectionality principle that you brought up is where like that needs to be brought in, right? Like definitely and added to that.
And one last comment. My home archdiocese is the Archdiocese of Newark, where we had Ted McCarrick. And also, I was in Washington, D.C., when he was Cardinal Ted McCarrick, because my degree is from Catholic U. And you want to talk about all kinds of crazy stuff? I could write a book.
Thanks.
That's so hard to follow because I don't have a comment. I want to acknowledge, Kate, that you said like top down would be the best, and I'm like, oh my God, if we could do that, that would be the best thing. But I think that's probably not the way that it's going to go. It's probably going to be bottom up. And so I left the church. That was exciting, and I really love this presentation that she put together. But I was wondering if any of you, now armed with trauma-informed rhetoric, are still in the church, and how that's going for you.
Yeah, I'm in the church. It's all right. You know, I don't know if I have anything particularly enlightened to say, but just that, like, it's hard and you do kind of have to take the good with the bad. And, like, that's one of the reasons why I, like, really love doing this research, is that I feel like it helps me better understand some of those really challenging parts of the church and maybe do what I can from the bottom up to, like, start making those changes.
And I think for myself, I would say, being really honest, you know, like it's been a struggle, especially since like 2018 for me. And that's a lot of where our last paper came from, was a presentation I gave at a conference where at the Catholic Theological Society of America, I was like, I have no idea why I'm here at all anymore. You know, it was me using everyone as my therapist, basically. And but I will say one thing that I've realized, especially from this research project, is that I think I'm in the church, but I know the church is in me. That I have been so habituated into this culture through my entire life that the idea of leaving, I can't just take that out of me and put it away, right? Those, like Bancroft talks about, the cultures, the way that we think, that is ingrained in us from a young age, and I don't just choose my way out of it like that, right? Right. So that's what. Yeah. Yeah, and so that's what I mean when I say it's in me that way. But yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
You walked out. I have to pick up on this. What you walked out of is the institution. You didn't walk out to Catholicism because if you say, I was never in Catholicism. Right. Well, any institution that is this. We walk out of the institutions that are abusive, but we don't walk out of the traditions. We don't walk out of the other because take, for example, Catholicism. I know a lot of people, more people than got in, in some ways. But the fact is that you've got many models of church. Right now, one of the problems that we have is one predominant model, which is church as institution. But if you look at church as community, church as creation, then it's so inclusive. But we have lots of problems with the models that we have that are exclusive and that are pushing people out.
So in the interest of time, because we're a little over, I just want to plug something that Lex Crawford, her organization, is doing, which is called Camp Hope in Oregon. So Camp Hope is a summer camp for children and youth whose families are receiving support through a Safe Place Family Justice Center, and builds bridges for campers to connect with nature, themselves, and their community. While on site, campers participate in an array of camp activities, including skits and camp songs, arts and crafts, water activities such as kayaking and rafting, ropes courses, and horseback riding. Campers also engage in curriculum and discussion that promotes healing and connection. This QR code, if you take a picture of that, will bring you to the volunteer application page. They're looking for people to volunteer as counselors at this camp. It's a fantastic opportunity to engage with community and to do some good. Is there anything that you wanted to add about it?
Yeah, just quickly. I could talk about Camp Hope all day. It's so much fun. It's fantastic. I will say it will be like the best time of your life. I didn't get to go to summer camp as a kid, so I'm living vicariously through this. Yeah, we are looking for counselors. That's usually the biggest gap for us. That's folks staying in the cabins with the kiddos. So that's a full week, but if you can't commit to a full week, it's actually like 5 days, 4 nights. We are also looking for support staff, and that's 2 to 3 days, or whatever you're able to commit. It can count towards I don't know if you have like volunteer hours or something. We can count towards that. But yeah, it's really wonderful, and we get you trained on all kinds of trauma-informed stuff, so you're prepared to work with kiddos, and it's incredible. It's an amazing time.
Thank you so much. And then lastly, Kate's going to just talk about anybody who might want to join this group next year.
Yeah, so we will still be around. This QR code is going to take you to our application and our website itself. On there, you'll find a couple different project descriptions, which you can talk about what our group and those who are remaining are going to be talking about and what that project's going to entail. Dr. Patty McShane is also going to be opening up a group. And then, yeah, we have a couple other descriptions up there that you can follow. In addition, we also have our Chirp Lab Instagram, which you can keep updated as well to keep us going. Okay, whatever. And then you can also look at our website, which will have the link to our this presentation up there, as well as our past presentation, if you want to take time to do that.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.